Howdy howdy, TW here. In this video we're going to look at melee attack and melee defense stats in Warhammer Total War and how they affect the outcome when two units collide. We'll go into the formula and see how it operates, especially with respect to the modifiers it has and how it works. Then we'll use that to make a representative graph of what we think the outcome should look like. We'll take that information and actually do some testing and see what the outcomes are so we can get a feel for how big the impact of one stat point is. Then finally, we'll look at the difficulty settings in game from easy to hard to very hard to legendary and how they affect combat in game. Hope you're ready. Let's get started. Here we have the melee attack formula for a minor versus minor encounter. I've really kind of made a quick and dirty calculation and not included all the rest, so it's really easy to understand how the base formula functions. Your chance to hit another unit in melee starts with a base percentage, which is 40%, plus the melee attack of your unit minus the melee defense of their unit. In this case, minors have both 18 melee attack and 18 melee defense, so the chance for one minor to hit another minor is the same as the base, 40%. As your melee attack goes up, your chance goes up from 40%. As it goes down, your chances go down from 40%. The maximum this number can be is 90%, and the minimum it can be is 10%. Pretty straightforward. Now there's a lot of modifiers on this, but it doesn't really make sense as we explain this to go through them all. But things like Vigor, whether your unit's charging, whether your unit's getting hit in the front, side, or back, and there's also terrain modifiers, but I thought I'd give you a kind of an example of what the actual numbers are. So your Vigor Loss, when your unit is exhausted, it's only 85% as fast as it starts. It only makes use of 65% of its base armor. It only has 80% of its charge bonus, 85% of its melee attack, 65% of its melee defense, and your quarrelers or ranged units only reload 65% as fast. This actually really affects very defensive units like dwarfs, where they have high melee defense and high armor. So when they get exhausted, they really lose a lot of combat effectiveness. Your damage is a pretty straightforward formula. It takes your base damage times the armor mitigation of your opponent's armor, which is 0.75% per point of armor, plus the armor piercing damage. In this case, we have a minor whose base damage is 5, multiplied by 0.6, which is 0.75% of 80 armor, plus 17 for armor piercing, which equals 20 damage per successful hit. Now, there are some modifiers to this which cause a lot of randomness here, because your units actually have to hit each other. So animation speed affects things, whether the unit misses or hits or gets bumped around, and these things can make a big difference in the randomness of the outcome of the event between the two units. Ultimately, what we want to find out is what happens with this graph. And I basically made a quick representation of what we're trying to find out. And if we look at your enemy's DPS or damage per second based on their melee attack versus your melee defense and modifiers, as your stats increase, your melee defense increases, your enemy DPS is going to go down. It's going to go from some maximum to some minimum. And vice versa, your unit's DPS, as you increase your melee attack stats, is going to go up until it reaches some maximum. What we're really trying to find here is this win rate curve. We want to know where it goes from. At the beginning, you're winning 0% of the time, and at the end, you're winning 100% of the time. About how close do these stats have to be before your win rate starts going up? And in the middle, it'll be about 50%, and where do you get to about 100%? So what we really want to find is what's the difference in stats from usually losing to usually winning, so we can understand what those stats mean to our units in game. To test for this effect, I basically ran two minor units into each other. I started on hard difficulty so that I could give the AI a stat advantage, and then in each test I raised the chevrons of my units by 1, which gave me one additional attack point for melee attack and one additional melee defense, plus some vigor, because as you level up your units, you do get some vigor plus leadership. It's hard to calculate exactly how much of a difference these make, but that's not the key. Basically, I ran them into each other, timed it, and looked at the end hit points for me and the end hit points for them, calculated the DPS, and charted it. What we got is something really interesting. This looks kind of like our chart. It's not perfect because I only ran 5 tests for each stat set, which gave me 50 tests total. I'm sure if you ran 20, this curve would smooth right out. But basically, as expected, the enemy unit, the defensive DPS, starts high, and as my stats go up in melee defense, his DPS goes down. Now we have an outlier here and an outlier here, so it doesn't look quite good, but also when we look at our melee attack equaling our DPS, as we add our melee attack, our DPS goes up as expected, and these lines cross right about here. When we look at this line, which is our actual win percentage, again, this curve is not perfect, we see that basically the amount between usually losing, this is 0%, and usually winning, which is 100% of a win rate, is only about 5 chevrons or 10 stat points. And that's really significant. Now, there is a lot of variability in these numbers, and if we go back and look here on this very last test where I had the maximum amount of stat points available to my unit, I won one battle with only 984 hit points left, and I won another battle with 2,312 hit points left. So it's a really significant amount of deviation in that number. But when we look at these two, they look the same, and we can really see and understand how they interact. And that crossover point is only 10 stat points. So when you're looking at giving your unit stat points, really understand the difference between usually losing and usually winning can be 10 stat points, or losing badly and being competitive. Now, to look at the difference the actual game settings make to your modifiers the computer gets or you get, I looked first here at easy, which is -8 for the computer. Then we go and look at normal, which shows no combat modifier for the computer. Then we look at hard setting, and that setting is actually a positive modifier of 5. And then we look at the setting on very hard, where the combat modifier is -5 to your units and +10 to the computer. It's worth noting that there are no special combat modifiers for legendary. They use the same very hard settings. I went in and verified that by setting my game to legendary and going in and looking. Now, if you look at the campaign settings, the battle difficulty indeed says very hard, and you can't change it on legendary. That actually, the ability to change the battle difficulty is a really nice feature, because you can separate the campaign difficulty from the battle difficulty. So if you want to increase the difficulty of your campaign without having crazy battles where units of goblins rout longbeards, you can just keep the battle settings at normal or hard and move your campaign setting up to very hard, or change it whichever way you like. Now, if you look at the settings here, you can see, again, my settings are -5, and if we go and look at these orcs, again, you see the settings are +10. So what do all those stat points mean for how tough your battles are going to be? Well, if you look on easy settings, the computer gets that -8, which is equal to -8 chevrons for their units. So they have to level up a lot just to be equal. At normal, of course, everything is 0. On hard, the bonus gets 5, which is equal to 5 chevrons. So they start with a 10-point stat advantage, which is exactly why it shifts so much from going from normal to hard. And very hard and legendary, there's actually a 15 chevron difference, which is 30 stat points. Is pretty gargantuan. So when you see those YouTubers killing it on legendary, you can be impressed, because that is impressive. So that wraps up this brief look inside the numbers and the formulas and how everything works in melee combat. Hopefully you found that interesting, and if there's any questions or clarifications required, feel free to leave a comment. Hopefully I'll see you soon.